Welcome, everyone. My name is Pino Lopomo. I am the Alan Schwartz Professor of Business Administration at Fuqua, where I teach managerial economics. A key theme of my research is auction design. And before diving into the presentation, let me say two things. First of all, thank you all for being here. And if you have any questions, there is a comment sections where you can type your comments and they will appear in a pop-up windows that I'm monitoring, and I will tendentially try to answer these questions at the end, not to interrupt the flow of the presentation. So let's jump right in. The title of this paper is Optimal Procurement Quality Concern. Shout out to my co-authors, Nicola Persico and Alessandro Villa. Here's the story. The premise is that in procurement, when you're buying for a municipality, if you work for the government or for your company, adverse selection could be a problem. What does that mean? Well, if you have bidders that are willing to provide their service or sell you their goods at a low price, chances are, especially for certain goods, that what they're providing is also low quality. And so sometimes you can insure against low quality, or you can punish suppliers that provide low quality, but oftentimes you can't. And so the question is, what do you do when that risk is a serious risk? And so in this work, we propose a new auction format, which we call the Lola, the lowball lottery auction, which is optimal, maximizes the buyer expected surplus. And by surplus, I mean the difference between the maximum you pay for something and what you actually pay for something. So the best bang for your buck, essentially. The Lola is the optimal in the sense of maximizing buyers' expected surplus among all conceivable auction format. That is the power of this methodology that is used in economics called mechanism design. That's what was created by Roger Myerson, who created the field and won the Nobel Prize for it. And so if you are in the presence of adverse selection, we are going to show that the Lola is the best you can do to protect yourself as best as you can against the risk of buying lemons, buying low quality stuff. Okay? So what is this Lola? It's a descending price auction. Imagine all the bidders are in a room and they're looking at the clock, and the clock ticks down, and over time bidders gradually get out. The price is getting too low, it's below my cost, I'm out. Eventually you only have two bidders left, and the moment one of those two gets out, the clock stops, and that is the final price at which the last remaining bidder is willing to do it. And I'll describe this in more detail. So the Lola is a modification of this process where the price doesn't go all the way until only one bidder is left, but it stops at an optimally set threshold. Let's call that a floor price, right? If multiple bidders are still active at that floor price, then either you randomly select the winner, that's optimal, or if you have reasons to believe that bidders are different, they don't look ex ante the same to you, but maybe you trust one better because you work with them more than other bidders that are relatively newer, then you select the bidders among the ones who are still active at the floor price according to their reputation, according to what you think of them. And so the more severe your quality concerns are, the higher you're going to set the floor price. We prove this in the theoretical part of the paper when we establish mathematically all these results. And then in the paper, we also do a counterfactual analysis looking at Italian government auctions, where they have used first price auctions, where you go basically, you award the contract to the bidder who is willing to do it for the least. They use first price auction. Had they used instead optimal Lola in the environment they were able to estimate given the data, they would have done considerably better. We do the numerical exercise where the gains are about 15-20%. So before we go into the story I want to tell you, which is essentially a demonstration of our model, let me give you another empirical fact that motivates our analysis. So recently in the US public procurement, there's been new regulation that requires agencies, and by agencies I mean buyers, to publicize their auction when the expected payment exceeds $25,000. Before the regulation, relatively fewer participants showed up at any single auction. As a consequence of the fact that now these auctions had to be publicly advertised according to the monitor mechanisms, then many more bidders showed up. Not surprisingly, the winning bid was lower. However, the quality was also lower. And quality here means cost overruns and execution delays. I am the winner, and we agreed that I should do this in a week at a certain price. And then 3 days later, I say, look, I need more time, and you got to pay me more because there are unanticipated consequences. This is just bad quality. And if the buyer knows it's ex ante, he wants to protect against this. So indeed, what they did in most procurement auctions, they used the lowest price quote, similar to the first price auction that I was describing for Italian auctions, or they're the same, a descending auction where you wait until all bidders but one get out, and then you award the contract to the last remaining bidder at the price where the clock stopped. So let me begin with a description of the model. Let's first assume that there is no quality concerns. Let's first assume that you're buying a known commodity. I will maybe use this metaphor through the entire talk. Let's say you are working for a mining company and you buy all kinds of stuff at auctions. You buy safe things like furniture or stationery, right? And this would be the example one. And then we'll move to another one where quality is a little uncertain. Maybe you need a construction company to build a road in a remote part of the world, and the road is going to involve tunnels and bridges, and they may break down. And so you really need competent builders, but you don't need much about it. We're going to call that case a case of significant quality concerns. And then later on, maybe we'll look at an example where quality is even a bigger issue. Maybe you're contracting exploration for oil. Maybe you're looking for oil, and then you need a firm that really knows what they're doing, and you have to pay them a lot up front, and they may come up with nothing, or they may come up with something that's very risky. We're going to call that the case of severe quality concerns. So we're going to begin with no quality concerns. In this example, the buyer is willing to pay $200, and I have here on the x-axis the supplier's cost. And as you can see, the willingness to pay of the buyers is independent of the supplier's cost, because you know what you're buying and quality is not an issue. And so let's say that you're facing 4 potential suppliers. One of them has a cost of 68, another one 45, another one 24, and the last one 13. Now, each supplier knows their costs privately. The buyer does not know where they are. All the buyer knows is they're somewhere between 10, the minimum possible cost, and 100, the maximum possible cost. What do you do in this case? What is the auction format that maximizes the buyer's surplus? Again, the difference between the maximum they would have paid for something and what they actually end up paying. Well, you can run a descending auction. How does that work? You start with a very high price. In this case, you will start at 100 because you don't consider the possibility of the cost being higher than 100 in this story. And you decrease the asked price continuously, right? The proposed price. And anytime the price that's coming down reaches a supplier's cost, that supplier drops out. So the clock is going to go 99, 98, and so on. The moment it reaches 68, one of the suppliers says, I'm out. 3 are left. The price keeps going down. At 45, the second supplier goes out. Again, the buyer doesn't know where they are. And so the moment you see them out, you say, okay, I guess your cost was 68, but I cannot use that information. I keep going until the price reaches the second lowest cost, which in this example is 24. And then that second to last bidder gets out. The remaining bidder, whose true cost is at 13, but the buyer does not know what it is. The buyer only knows that the cost of the remaining bidder is anywhere between 10 and 24. He will get to sell the good or the service, and therefore his profit will be the price at which the clock stopped, which is 24, minus its cost 13, and the remaining part of the gains from trade, that 200 minus 24, that's all buyer surplus. So as you can see, when quality is not an issue, you really leverage competition with this descending auction, waiting until everybody but one supplier leaves, and that's the price you're paying to the remaining supplier. And it is a mathematical fact that under certain conditions, you cannot do better than this in terms of maximizing your expected buyer surplus. So on average, when you have 4 random draws that could be anywhere between 10 and 100, the lowest of them will be a 28. The second lowest will be a 46. And those two are what matters for the outcome. Because if you run a descending auction many, many times in these environments, on average, the clock will tend to stop at the second lowest cost of 46. The bidders with the lowest cost, who on average will be at 28, will enjoy a profit of 18. And the buyer surplus will be the difference between his willingness to pay up to 100 and the price, 17. 46. So 154 in this example is the expected buyer surplus by using descending auctions, which are optimal when there are no quality concerns on average. Let's now look at moderate quality concern. What does that mean? How do we capture quality concerns in our story? Well, remember your willingness to pay of 200. Well, that's no longer the case. Now you're willing to pay a premium if you know that the supplier's cost is higher. The story being, presumably, suppliers who have higher costs are also producing higher quality services or good. Whereas if you know that somebody's willing to do it for lower, then you get pessimistic about what they're going to be able to deliver. They're going to be late. They're going to ask for overruns. They're going to, provide shoddy services and materials and goods. And so your willingness to pay now is increasing in the cost of the supplier. What do you do in this environment? Well, it turns out that I'm choosing this adjective, with a certain care. Moderate quality concern means that as long as the slope of this new willingness to pay function is not too steep, then it's still optimal to use a second price option, as we will see. But later on, things will change, and the Lola will come into the story. So let's look at the more severe quality concern. I have taken that blue increasing function and I made it steeper. I'm going to call this an example of significant quality concerns, where it's no longer optimal to use a descending auction and you want to use a Lola, and I'll tell you more about that. And then finally, this would be the case of building a road in the remote part of the world, where you might run into some trouble. You can still fix it. It's going to cost you, but it's not so bad. And then you are here in the case of severe quality concern, where you can see that this blue line is very steep. And you really would like not to have to deal with low-cost suppliers because the quality is going to be so bad that you're willing to pay very little. So you might end up, paying more and regretting having to sign a contract with these type of suppliers. Whereas the premium now is very high. In other words, it matters a lot now, quality to you, and that's capturing the slope of this blue function. So again, let's go back to moderate quality concern. Mathematically, you can show that the best you can do here is still a descending auction, because your quality concerns are not severe enough, and you want to let competition and competitive pressure on the suppliers to determine the price. It is no longer the case that, with no quality concern, your expected surplus was 124 as we calculated before. Now it was 154 as we calculated before. Now it's a little lower because your price will end up down here. Remember, if you run a descending auction, the second lowest price here is 46. So you'll tend to get draws of this kind in this region where your willingness to pay is lower. So you are hurt by the presence of moderate quality concerns, although it's still not necessary, not useful to change the mechanism you're using, which is this ascending auction. Now I'm going to look at the next case, significant quality concerns. Now, if you ran a descending auction, you end up here where what you're willing, your expected surplus is too low, and you can do better. And the way to do better is to say to the bidders, we're going to start with the clock at 100. The clock is going to go down continuously. People are going to drop out, but the moment the clock reaches 55 here, I've drawn a line here at position 55, you're going to stop the clock. And if there is only one supplier still active, no problem. But if there is two or more, it's possible in theory sometimes that all four are below. Then because you don't have any further information to distinguish the suppliers, you're going to randomly select one of them. And if you do that, you're using this Lola with floor price of 55, your buyer expected surplus is 124. I've calculated it. We have the mathematical machinery to calculate all these numbers. Whereas, and it was 154 with no quality concerns when your willingness to pay was flat, when quality was not a worry for you. But if you did use a descending auction, you would do far worse. And I haven't calculated the number here, but I will do it in the next case to show you the comparison. So let's move to the third case. Suppose that now you're really worried about quality. Again, you're hiring a company to go explore in the ocean somewhere and looking for oil, and they might know what they're doing, in which case their cost structure is high. They have sophisticated instruments and machinery, or they might just be impersonating a serious firm and not knowing a good job and counting on some luck. but you don't know who's who, right? And so again, if you ran a descending price auction now, you would make only 64 in expected revenue, which is very low, because you would end up paying little, but also getting something that's almost useless to you. You're willing to pay very little for that low quality. If you had the benchmark again was 154 when quality was not an issue, what you want to do in this case is your quality concerns are so severe that you essentially, that floor price, you push it high all the way to the top. Essentially, you say to these bidders, there is 4 of you, I'm too worried about selecting one of you with a really low cost structure and therefore low quality. I will randomly from the start select one of you, lucky one. I will pay 100, which is the highest possible cost you might have, and that's going to be the end of the story. This is a totally random mechanism. Again, because I want to edge against the risk of selecting a low cost suppliers. Remember that when we let the price go down, the first suppliers to leave are the one with the higher cost, which are also the higher quality. So the more you push it in the price dimension, the more you push the price down, the more likely it is you lose high quality suppliers and you're left with low quality suppliers. That is the meaning of adverse selection, this expression that was coined by Akerlof, who won the Nobel Prize for this idea. And so, again, here we are so worried about quality concerns that the best we can do is to say, well, there's not going to be any auction. I know your highest possible cost, the 4 of you, is 100. Let me propose 100 to you, randomly selected. And unfortunately, that's the best you can do. But again, if you did a descending auction, you will be expecting a much, much lower buyer expected surplus. Okay. So I think I went through most of what I wanted to say. I have some closing remarks. First of all, as the number of bidder increases, suppose that instead of 4 suppliers, you have 10 or 20 or 50, then 2 things happen. And you are in a world in which concerns, quality concerns are significant or severe. In other words, they're not moderate. You are worried about quality. Then if you keep naively insisting on using a descending auction, you're going to do worse and worse. Paradoxically, increasing competition, which naive economic intuition suggests, how can be more buyer participating be bad, right? Is more competition is good for me. No, the problem is, as you increase the number of bidders in the auction, that lowest possible cost is going to get closer to 0, and the second lower cost is also going to close to 0. In other words, you're more and more likely to hit really the low region of the cost interval, which also means the lowest quality. And that matters a lot to you by assumptions. We are talking about significant or severe quality concerns. So attracting more bidders and being naive about the auction rule you're going to use, which is a descending auction, will hurt you. Whereas if you use the optimal Lola with optimally computed floor prices, then more bidders will help you. So you want, if you go back to the US procurement case, you want to advertise and encourage and attract more bidders only if you know what you're doing, so to speak, if you're using the optimal Lola as opposed to naively going from the lowest for the lowest price. So that's kind of the first insight of what I've been saying so far. And the second thing I want to spend a minute on, asymmetric suppliers, right? Suppliers where maybe now ex ante before the auction, you already think of some suppliers in better terms than others because you work with them together. They've shown that they're more reliable. Quality is less of an issue for them. So that V function, that blue increasing function, depends on the suppliers. For some of them, it's steeper. For some of them, it's flatter. And what you want to do now is you're still going to come up with a floor price. But once you hit the floor price, you are going to select the winner, not randomly anymore, but according to their best reputation. If 3 suppliers are left, you're going to pick the one that you like best according to these ex ante criteria, the reputation they have with you before the auction started. And I guess that's all I wanted to say on this paper. So we have plenty of time to address some of the questions. So there's a question that says, can you give us more examples of the kind of companies who might use your auction system? Yeah, so first of all, one attractive feature of this auction is that it's simple. All you have to do is to come up with a floor price. and it's robust. And robustness is a great word to use when you do auction design, because robust means if your model isn't exactly capturing everything there is to capture of the particular situation where you want to understand, still the probability of making big mistake is low. Is robust in the sense that just like a descending auction in a Lola at any floor price, it is optimal for each supplier to get out at its cost and stay in until the price is above its cost, no matter what other people are doing in the auction, right? In the parlance of game theory, we say that that is a dominant strategy for each bidder in the auction to get out of its cost. And so that's the sense in which there is a simple, usable, practical auction that we hope that people start using. Few months ago, the Italian government rewrote some of the legislation and the regulation concerning the way they do procurement auction, and they introduced some language that alludes to the optimal Lola, also borrowing from what they do in Korea, where they do put a floor price, although in that case, the floor price is kept secret and there is a little bit of uncertainty about the floor price. The rationale being there maybe collusion may be an issue. And if you make the rules of the auction too transparent, bidders can get together and manipulate and game the system. And so as an auctioneer, I want to sort of intimidate my bidders by creating some uncertainty even about the rules of the auctions. And, you know, big buyers with bargaining power can do that, right? Other examples that come to mind is anything you need a report or like you need an expert to look into something and either give you an assessment of the situation that requires technical knowledge or produce a good or a service like a piece of software that executes a number of tasks. Quality, of course, matters a lot. And so again, the idea is if you are buying from somebody who's willing to do it for very cheap, well, their opportunity cost isn't big. That means they're not doing anything else. That means their services are not in great demand, right? Or another case that comes to mind is I have former students that work at AB InBev. They produce beer and they buy lots of things at auctions every day. In particular, they buy hops. They buy the ingredients that go into their beer, and there is randomness in the quality of the hops. Sometimes it's a great weather-related season, and the hops are great. In which case, the supplier is going to demand more because if they don't sell it to you, they're going to sell it for somebody else at a high price, right? And so this idea that quality is correlated to cost, willingness to pay the buyer is correlated to cost, is sort of consistent with all these stories where you're worried about quality. All right, so let's see, I have another question here. I'm going to read it slowly. Ifra, founder and CEO at Ice Drone Ifra. Consider the rapid revolution of markets and technologies. What are the potential areas for further research in auction theory, particularly about the Lola? Yeah. Are these considerations for adapting the Lola model to cater dynamic nature? Absolutely. So an exciting follow-up project that we are considering is the following. I alluded to reputation of the bidders. And so what you may want to do, especially if you have a big buyer facing several sort of smaller suppliers, therefore you have bargaining power, you may get into long-term relations with these suppliers. And so you may want to create some kind of dynamic score system that is a way of quantifying the reputation, right? And informally, they already do this at AB InBev, for example, talking to my former students. They've been dealing with the suppliers all the time. And the moment the supplier does something they don't like, I don't come through in time, I'm a disappointment in the execution of the contract, then I am punished by being excluded by future auctions and by being sort of given a differential treatment in auctions because I am being punished for a while. And so this managing dynamically over time a set of suppliers is a fascinating problem. It's not the first time that comes up. It has been studied in other settings, not about quality, but simply about the trade-off that you have between keeping weak suppliers around because you do want some competitive pressure. If you always buy from the same supplier, that supplier gets better and better at doing what you want. all the other suppliers leave because they see no hope of continuing, but then their bargaining power becomes stronger because they're the only supplier you can buy from. And so you do want to keep weaker supply around just to put competitive pressure on the stronger supplier. So this idea of managing dynamically, optimally over time your pool of suppliers by adjusting the terms of trade you do with them is sort of the comprehensive goal of this type of research. Okay, so last question. You provide a freely available software for companies who want to use it. Yes, it's on our website. That's a great question, actually. So the idea is very simple. If, say, I'm consulting for you, you are interested in using this option, you call me up, and the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to interview you. I will try to get out of you a sense of where you believe the cost of the suppliers are. What is your belief about the likelihood of different cost values for different suppliers, right? That's the starting point. And once we know that you believe that there are these 4 suppliers that roughly their costs are between 10 and 100, then I'm going to ask you, okay, if you learn a supplier's cost is really 21, how much are you willing to pay for that? If your answer is about the same, 200, 200, 200, then that means you're not worried much about quality, and I will say, let's use a descending option. But if you say, no, wait a second, if you're telling me that the supplier's cost is really low, then I don't want to touch him, you're willing to pay very little, then you enter the realm of significant or severe quality concerns, in which case I will calculate optimally, and that's what the software does, calculates optimally that floor price in order to maximize your expected surplus. Again, the difference between what you would be willing to pay and what you actually pay, protecting you against the risk of running a naive descending auction where you end up, oftentimes regretting the final contract that you sign. All right. Looks like my timer is telling me that half an hour is gone. So thank you much for listening to me and being here. Next month, please join Professor Ali Makdoumi. That's on Wednesday, January 3rd, same time, 12:30 p.m. The title of his talk is Risk of Behavioral Manipulation When Users of Digital Platforms Share Personal Data. That's the topic. Again, thank you, and see you next time.